In today's urban world, it's easy to feel disconnected from nature and the land. Yet, modern life and environmentalism don't have to be opposed. There are ways to embrace both. FortWhyte Alive is an example, reclaimed from an industrial site into a stunning natural sanctuary. There are many ways to reconnect with nature. So, let's find out.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jeff. I am the Group and Corporate Programs Coordinator at FortWhyte Alive.
FortWhyte Alive is a place that I've always wanted to go. My one friend keeps telling me, he's like, we're going to go on a double date there. It hasn't happened yet, but we keep planning, we keep hoping to make it there. Why don't you tell me a little bit about FortWhyte Alive? What is it? Where is it? Yeah,
so FortWhyte is a nature center sort of in the southwest corner of Winnipeg. We have 640 acres of wetlands, lakes, tall grass prairies, and aspen parkland. We have several kilometers of crushed limestone trail, a couple of buildings that have like interpretive information and displays inside. It's just a really good way for Winnipeggers to come learn about some environmental and outdoor education and recreation.
I know I've been to Okamic Marsh a couple of times, going out there, especially during the early migration when birds are just arriving. It's just so exciting. And FortWhyte is a cool place because it's much closer than Okamic Marsh. So for individuals looking to check it out, you mentioned like there's trails, an interpretation center. I also know there's like some construction going on. What's happening?
Yeah, so right now we actually have a very large new building going up along McGilvery. So it'll be an additional entry point for many people. Plus it'll have additional space for people to rent and for programming. So it's going to be called Buffalo Crossing. It's 80,000 square feet. It's going to be the greenest commercial building in all of Manitoba, if not Canada.
Wow, that's cool. That's one thing I really like, modernizing buildings to be green and efficient. Like, we shouldn't have to fight with nature. We should become a part of it. And I think that's a goal of any like nature center like FortWhyte Alive, where you're trying to reconnect people with nature. Because I've had a conversation with a lot of people, and oftentimes, especially living here in Winnipeg or just any large city, like Toronto is a good example. Once you're downtown, it's just buildings and concrete. You can really forget that, there's a natural world beyond us.
Well, and the really fun thing with FortWhyte is that you come and visit now and you see all this great nature and it seems really natural. But about 70 years ago, if you were standing like right in the middle of where our buildings are, it would have looked like the surface of the moon. It was an entirely different place. It was actually a cement factory. Oh. So we have 5 lakes on the property, which is where Canada Cement and then Lafarge actually quarried clay and gravel for making cement. Then 1950 comes along, big flood in southern Manitoba, fills up those quarries, and it really wasn't worth it for them to pump the water out. 70 years condensed into one sentence. That's essentially how FortWhyte came to be. It was a bunch of the folks thought, what if we reclaim this land for nature and use it to teach our kids, basically teach our city kids how to be outdoor kids, teach them about fishing and recreation outside and just environmental education.
Reclaiming of nature. Like, there's so many opportunities to do that. Like, there's so many spaces across Canada empty, unused. Like, how many parking lots are basically 90% empty every day that could be repurposed into something else?
Yeah, well, and so like the north 3/4 of our property we've got a significant amount of aspen parkland, so forest, but then a big chunk of it used to be a sugar beet farm. And it wasn't very good farmland. The groundwater is very saline. So historically, there wasn't a lot going on there. They farmed it for a couple of decades, but nothing too crazy, and it wasn't really worth continuing. So they sold off a bunch of the properties along McCreary for residential, but then a big portion was sold to FortWhyte, and it's now been reclaimed for tall grass prairie, and we also now host the world's largest urban bison herd.
That's really cool. Wow.
Yeah, so we currently have over 40 bison It's an educational breeding herd, or an educational conservation herd, sorry, not breeding herd. But they were seeded from the Parks Canada herd, so they're a really good example of what like quote unquote wild bison can be.
When we're looking at FortWhyte Alive and we're looking at this, this reclaimed space, you've got a lot of centers for people to learn about things. What are those conversations about environmentalism? Right now, when we're looking at the city of Winnipeg, there's talks in place working alongside Indigenous communities for green spaces and biodiversity. Oh, what's the place? It's a place a little bit down it's like called the Little Forks or something like that. I can't quite remember. But they're looking at preserving that region and making it a conservation spot as well. There's conversations going on with the current like homeowners and things on that property, but no further development, helping retain that area. So when we're looking at FortWhyte Alive and these conversations are happening outside, what sort of conversations are you having, whether that is with different governments, municipal, provincial, or just individuals here in Winnipeg?
The biggest part of what we do is environmental and outdoor education. We see well over 30,000 school kids per year who come out to learn about how does a wetland work, how does a prairie work, but then we also do get into the history of it. So because in the prairies, there was a fairly significant Indigenous population. So we are not an Indigenous organization, but we are doing everything we can to make sure that we pay tribute and honor the land that we are on. But with that, it's about using the land responsibly. And so, like I mentioned, over 30,000 school kids per year that come out to learn about the environmental impact of humans on the prairies, but also we see 100,000 visitors a year in general. So a lot of people coming out. We have fishing programs. We have bison safaris where I take you out in a big van and I teach you about bison. We get up nice and close, as safe as possible, staying in the van. But so a huge array of programming options beyond just coming and going
Walking
for a
into
walk.
a center, going for there's like fishing. Well, one of them was like not boat tours, but boat explorations where you can take a canoe, go through some of those areas, or a kayak. I can't quite remember which one.
Yeah. So with FortWhyte, we have our paddle nights on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We also, for private groups and school groups, we have a voyageur canoe. So it's a big,
fun,
large canoe that sits like 16 children. It only fits like 12 adults, but so you can get it's just sort of to get exploring the lakes. Kendrick Outdoor Adventures is on site and they rent canoes and kayaks, stand-up paddleboards, and pedal boats. So you can also sort of just see the city from a different perspective and just sort of get involved with that outdoor recreation, which is an important part of really appreciating the environmental education side of it.
Let's go back quickly to the Indigenous perspective that you're touching on. Just from my perspective, when we're looking at land development, land reclaiming, and environmentalism, you can't do that without working with and acknowledging Indigenous communities, people who fostered the land for tens of thousands of years here. What sort of relationship does FortWhyte have with Indigenous communities? Do you have someone you talk with regularly? What does that look like?
Yeah, we have a number of Indigenous advisors that we sort of lean on when it comes to even just producing new programming or educational displays. We do have a couple of different teepees on site, and especially when it comes to our bison herd. The bison were so incredibly integral to the Indigenous lifestyle, but also their spirituality, the whole life was built around the bison. And so even when it comes to when you have a herd of bison, there will unfortunately be the occasional bison that does pass away. And we have an elder that we work with to properly recognize the bison and we have a proper ceremony in place. So it's not just
here it is, it's done.
The goldfish equivalent of flushing it down the toilet does not happen.
Yeah, well, I think what is it at the zoo? They have the white bison and it has that story talking about it as more of a spiritual being.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about that, I'm a big bison nerd. There was actually this past year there was a wild quote unquote albino bison
Ooh.
born in Yellowstone. They don't think it actually survived, but it was there's lots and lots of discussion, and it was like raising a lot of excitement amongst especially the indigenous communities because it is so rare for it to happen in the wild.
Yeah, and I think that's just another perspective of taking the time to learn about the creatures around us. In terms of climate change and just the cutting down of forests and developing of land for other uses, it could all too quickly like just disappear the world around us. Watching Planet Earth documentary with David Attenborough, and he's talking about how our wild spaces have been reduced worldwide by approximately like 70% or something like that. It is something that within this and a few generations, we need to be very cognizant of.
Yeah, and what's really nice with that too is like Winnipeg is very fortunate by having a place like Fort White that has been around officially as it is since 1966. We have this really good green corridor that goes from Fort White into Assiniboine Forest, up to Assiniboine Park. And then it's really not even a huge jump to get into like the airport. And like the airport is obviously very developed, but there's nice open space. And so we see a very good migration of multiple different types of birds. Little just bird trivia fact for you. Do you have any guesses as to how many species of bird we get in Manitoba as a whole?
Okay. Well,
in a year.
In a year, I'm gonna say something. I'm gonna highball it. I'm gonna say around 1,300.
Okay, it is less than that.
Okay, less than that.
It is 450.
Okay, I went too much.
That's with like Manitoba has three very distinct like ecosystems with the prairies. Up north, you've got more of your tundra or pre-tundra, and then you also have your Canadian Shield. But so at Fort White, we see on average close to 150 species of birds, just Fort White alone. So it's a really good example of the biodiversity that you were mentioning before. Like we see that diversity just at Fort White alone, but that really is an example of how Winnipeg is a good ecosystem in general. Like we have one of the best tree canopies in North America for any major city, and that really goes to like we have a huge woodpecker population, like of all the birds. Like we have a significant variety of woodpecker compared to other major cities, and it's because we have these large green spaces like Fort White and Assiniboine Forest, as well as a good healthy tree canopy.
Well, like talking about other conservation and like these animals, like what is it? There's the efforts for the plover. I think like different areas there. We have the burrowing owl protections. Like there's so many interesting species that you can see from time to time. Like sometimes you don't think about it. It's like, no eagles. Like some time to time you can see falcons. But, you know, if you're lucky, you can see like bald eagles and stuff pass through here.
The very southwest corner of Fort White, we have a nesting pair.
Oh, nice.
They were on our property last summer. This year, they've actually made a nest just south of our property. You can see it from our lake still. But so there's a pair of eagles that are there. And so we see the eagles pretty much year round. One of the coolest things with the eagles, you were mentioning a good time at Okamic is the migration season. Fort White is very interestingly situated within the city because to the west, we have lots of farmers' fields. A Canada goose requires water to digest. So the geese are out in the field for most of the day. They fly into Fort White lakes for the evening because they like to spend time at water, but they need the water to digest. We get up to 10,000 geese per night. Mid-September until mid-October, we get significant amounts of goose migration. But then we've also been seeing a big increase in gulls, like different types of gulls, ring-billed gulls, Franklin gulls, herring gulls, those sorts of things. But what's always really neat is you'll see a big section of like 1,000 or 2,000 gulls floating on the lake. Then all of a sudden you just see them all erupt and fly off into the sky. And it's because one of those eagles has done a little swoop. They're kind of either looking for a little snack or just testing out what's up with the flock.
Well, like taking like these efforts to preserve natural areas or repurpose them. What was it, the peregrine falcon? Was it back in the 70s or 60s or something? Almost disappeared from the prairie provinces, and like now we have a population. I don't actually know how healthy it is right now, but we have some. And I mean, there was a couple of years ago, like the falcon cams and things you can see on the
in
buildings.
downtown Winnipeg, and you could watch your live cam of their nest and watch the little Falklings, whatever.
Yeah,
the
I'm
baby
not quite sure what they're
falcons.
called.
You could watch them grow.
Yeah, and I think it's so exciting, like seeing nature, and particularly FortWhyte Alive, being a part of nature and learning about it beyond just reading it in a book.
We've done, and like, not to, pat myself on the back here, but we've been doing a really good job with trying to make sure that we are as accessible as possible to all the different demographics of Winnipeg. We are situated in the far south, and we currently are not on a bus path. When our new building is ready, there are 3 bus routes that will actually come right onto FortWhyte property. So keep your fingers crossed for next spring. We should be open into our new building with bus access, but we're trying to like make ourselves as accessible as possible to as much of Winnipeg as possible, just because it is such a good place to be and a good way to get in touch with nature and to learn a thing or two.
You got hikes, you got tours with kids, you have the paddle nights. Those are more kind of like warmer seasonal stuff. What sort of things are open during the winter or fall seasons?
Yeah, so fall, it is migration season. So Wednesday through Sunday, we're open in the evenings to watch that migration, to watch those thousands of geese fly in right as the sun is setting. You see the geese flying in from the west. It's a reduced rate for the evening, and it's kind of a more, not a festival atmosphere or anything, but we have stuff going on. There's activities. It's fun. Once we get through that, we have about 8 kilometers of cross-country ski trails. So once there's snow on the ground, we have cross-country skiing available. We have all sorts of snowshoeing locations. So we have snowshoes that people can rent and come and try out. We have a skating pond. We've got all sorts of stuff. And plus just activities going all the time. Especially weekends.
Well, I think that ties into that accessibility, right? Like if you have a center and it's only open during the warmer times of the year, that's a big chunk of a time here in Manitoba that no one can go to. So having it open year round gives people the opportunity to also find activities. Like sometimes people say, "Oh, there's nothing to do in winter." It's like, well, you just got to look for it a little bit.
Yeah, we do, like I said, a whole wide range of things. We have a new public programs coordinator, and they're doing an excellent job of like revamping what we do and bringing in a new, fresh perspective, again, just to try to bring in different types of people.
So if someone wants to find out more or get involved, how can they do that?
Yeah, so our website is always just the best place to go, fortwhyte.org. So FortWhyte.org. On there, if people are wanting to volunteer, we're always looking for volunteers. If you're interested in memberships, we have our memberships are quite affordable, and we do also have subsidized memberships for those who have some economic hardships, or even for new Canadians. For new Canadians, we actually have a free 6-month membership. There's a little bit of documentation required, but this is all listed on our website. And then just email is a good way to get a hold of us as well.
Perfect. So, I mean, that's a great opportunity for newcomers and immigrants who want to learn more about the province that they're now living to find out.
And again, it's a good way to sort of figure out your place in the city. It's a good juxtaposition of your the history of where Manitoba and Winnipeg has been, and really where we're going and how we can get there as sustainably as possible.
Have any stories you'd like us to share or communities we should highlight? Leave a comment on our social media or reach out to us on our website. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.